and welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This week, the end of the book of Numbers, book of Bamidbar, Matot-Masei, a double portion reading. Our subject this week on asking. I spend a lot of my time with my work, talking to people and working with organizations and leaders on fundraising. Crowdfunding specifically, helping people develop campaigns and building campaigns so that they can raise as much money as possible so that ultimately can do as much good as they're able to do in the world. And one of the things that I have spent a lot of time on in the last number of years, going really deep on and spending a lot of time on, is the notion and understanding of how to make a great ask. What goes into asking someone for something? And over the course of time, developed a couple of sort of approaches and philosophies and ideas and strategies about how to understand that and how to get people to go about doing that and then to ultimately ask and raise as much money as possible. And it comes from experience, both personal experience and asking people for money. It comes from research and reading, and it comes from trial and error. And there's a lot of ways to get that right, and there's a lot of ways to get an ask completely wrong. And it's important to begin to appreciate how to make your best ask each and every time that you walk into those situations. And the reality of it is to begin with the idea that asking for something is an exchange. And that in the same way that a person goes into a store to purchase something, that there's an exchange of money for goods, or there's money for service, whatever that is. So that in an ask, when we're asking someone for a donation, we're asking someone to borrow something, we're asking for someone for advice, or we have a question, we're asking, that is an exchange as well. It could be an exchange of information, it could be an exchange of goods, it can be an exchange of money, it can be an exchange of favors, whatever that is, there's an exchange going on from both sides. So there's the giver and the receiver, the giver and the taker, there's a giver and a giver. However one sort of looks at it, is an ask involved. And more often than not, we get them wrong. We may get sort of close to the result that we want, but we don't always get the result that we actually want from the ask. And so it's just a question of figuring out, how do I in each situation optimize, maximize, and make my best ask each and every time? And it's hard to do. So my experience when I tell people all the time is that many situations, and I walked in from terms of fundraising, I made the wrong ask. So for the example I tell all the time is that I met with a donor a number of years ago. I was working in an organization. We were building a dormitory. And this donor was a good donor. He had been donating for many, many years. He had a very good relationship with the institution. And he was a real estate guy, and I thought this is the perfect opportunity to ask him to make a very significant capital donation to this institution for this dormitory project. We sat and we had lunch. We had met a bunch of times. We had a good relationship. And I made the ask, and he looked at me and he said, "I don't give to buildings. I give to people." And he said, "I work in real estate, but no one should assume that my philanthropy is also in real estate." And so I'd gotten everything else right, and I got the ask completely wrong. And it sort of blew up in my face. Now, luckily for me, I had another ask in my pocket. I had another way to go about this and ask for something else. And then I was able to make a different ask, which actually worked for him. And he then gave a significant donation to the institution. Thank God. So it's a question of appreciating how to make the right ask and how to put the right words in your mouth so that when you go to the person who has what you want, that you can ask the right way and get the result that you seek. And the reason I bring this up is that in this week's reading, we have a very significant moment. In chapter 32, the children of the tribes of Reuben and Gad have a request of Moses. And their ask of Moses is to settle on the other side of the Jordan. That's the premise. The goal for them is to get an approval, an acceptance, a stamp, a sign of some sort that it would be okay for them to settle on this side, the east bank, the eastern side of the Jordan River, in the lands that they had just conquered, that they had taken from the Amorites and other nations there. whatever one thinks about that request, considering that they had spent 40 years in the desert and that the entire generation had died out and that this younger generation was supposed to go into the land and very soon into the land and all these other things, that's what they wanted. That was the goal of this request. But when one reads the chapter and read chapter 32, one appreciates the fact that Moses isn't thrilled with this request. He gives it to them for a set of verses beginning in verse 6, going all the way through verse 15. He gives it to them. A full-on, heavy rebuke of the people for making this request. And when one looks at it, you can appreciate where Moses is coming from. And it's not to say that Moses isn't the right person to ask. He is the right person to ask. And it's not to say that this isn't the right ask or that this isn't possible. It's to appreciate where Moses is coming from in his rebuke and the things that he says and the things that he shares with them. When one looks at this actually in the Bible itself, in its scroll, one notices that before Moses actually speaks, there's almost like a pause there. You can imagine what Moses is thinking when they approach him and Eleazar the priest and the leaders of the people and they make this request. What is going through Moses' mind at that moment? We can consider what's possible. We know based on what he says, obviously, about what he might be thinking in that moment when they're making this request of him. And we know we don't have to go through all of it, but he's not going in. He's not going into the land. This has been the path. This has been the goal. There have been disasters on the way, and now they're at the cusp of this goal happening, and this group of people wants to stay on this side of the river. Like, that's hard to hear from Moses' standpoint. And he lets them know. But it's more than that he lets them know. He then goes in and does something amazing. Because after verse 15, beginning in verse 16, they recalibrate. Verse 16 begins and it says that they come to him and ask the following. The implication is that they left chastened and that they're coming back a second time and have rethought their ask, and now again are asking Moses a second time for the same thing, which is to go and settle on this side of the river. And so they change to some degree what they're asking, and Moses doesn't rebuke them the second time. In fact, Moses seems to accede to their request, and he's willing to give it to them and allow them to settle on the condition that they now learn from him how to have made that ask in the first place and how to have thought about that in the first place and to think about what the priority should have been initially when they came with this request of him and not in the way that they did. Because asking is an art. And getting the ask right to get the result that you want is not only an art, but there's a skill involved. And they got it wrong, even though they ultimately got what they wanted. And so Moses teaches them, beginning in verse 20, Moses begins to teach them what the priority should have been. And you can see it because it comes up multiple times in the course of the text until it actually comes out of their mouth. And the difference, the key difference, beyond all the other things that the commentary has discussed with respect to them focusing and talking about their cattle versus talking about their children and their families and their legacy, that's not exactly where Moses' focus is. He also focuses on one thing, which is God. They must put God first in this. So in Moses' response in verse 20, Moses says to them, if you do the following thing, if you go and you pioneer and you lead before God in this war, and then in verse 21, you cross the Jordan before God, before all the other people until they settle and destroy all the enemies. And then in the next verse, verse 22, and they capture the land before God. And then at the end of that verse, again before God, you get the idea that Moses is saying to them, you want this? I get it. Not happy about it? I shared what I thought with you before. But you're coming back and you're asking again. But if you want to ask for something, make sure that you ask properly. Make sure that you ask appropriately. Make sure that you appreciate what it is that you have to do to get what it is that you want from this. and that this should have been the initial impetus for what you want to do, is to put God first. Because asking is an art, and asking is a skill, and asking is a science. And beginning to appreciate how you go about building a great ask also has to require and appreciate that you understand the person that you're asking of, that you're asking from. So if it's in philanthropy, that it's the donor, understanding and knowing the donor. If it's this case, understanding and appreciating and knowing where Moses is at this moment in his life, in this space, in this time, in this place, on the edge of the land of Israel that he's not going into. And appreciating what Moses was about and what Moses focused in on, what was his priority in life, and put the ask in a language and in a structure and in a manner that respects that appreciates that, and then makes the ask ultimately. Because in this structure of an exchange, that respect, that sense of appreciation and gratitude, that sense of understanding and knowledge of who the person you're asking of this from is crucial and vital to your ultimate success. And so learning how to ask is really important for anything and everything, wherever that may be. Whether that's a person in the spiritual religious domain in prayer, speaking, beseeching God of something, asking of God, how to ask, how to pray, how to put that into language. Not easy to do, but doable. Whether that's in philanthropy, we're asking a donor for a donation, for a large donation, whatever that may be. If we're asking a parent for something, we're asking a friend for a favor, we're asking a colleague for something that is not easily gotten. And so we're making an ask. So it's an appreciation of how to ask, when to ask, whom to ask, the language of the ask, and what exactly the ask is. I call it in fundraising the 4 rights of asking: getting it right, the right person at the right time, making the right ask for the right amount. The 4 rights of asking. And so here the people of the tribes who are initially chastened by their ask, then hear Moses with respect to their coming back and asking again, and then Moses telling them what the responsibility is and what the goal is and how this is going to be, and Moses appointing it to Joshua and to Eleazar the priest, and then Moses then getting the response from them that they're going to do it in his way. And then that's exactly what happens. They then add God back into the equation. They then add the idea that the nation is first, that the people are first, and before anything else happens, that has to happen first, and they get what they want. Now, it happens to be that over the course of the Bible that these 2 tribes, that the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, do this a couple of times. It's a little bit, seems like they're running faster than maybe they're thinking to some degree, or they're less than precise with the manner in which they act and the manner in which they think through all of these things. It happens again in the book of Joshua. It happens again, I think, another time as well. And so it's important to sort of piece it together. But in the context here, asking is crucial. In life, if we don't ask for things, we don't get anything. I tell people all the time, 100% of the time that you don't ask, you don't get. And so here is the context of appreciating what I'll call the chutzpah, the good chutzpah, if you want to call it, of the people going and asking Moses of this request. Moses' response to them, then recalibrating and trying to ask again. Moses teaching them how they should have asked and how they should have set it up and how it should be understood by them in terms of what's going to happen. Them then acceding to and appreciating and accepting Moses' premise, putting it into action. Same thing with us. When we need to ask for things, it is incumbent upon us to first think about what it is that we're asking. Crystallizing and clarifying the language around the ask so that it is clear and that it is perfect and that it is ultimately successful. Appreciating also the timing of the ask. Appreciating and thinking through the person who is being asked of. And then ultimately having the gumption or the whatever term you want to use, foregoing and actually making the ask. You want to call it arrogance? I don't think arrogance is the right term, but going and actually making the ask. And so the ask and asking, the art of asking, the science of asking, the expertise of asking is something super crucial and super important for these people in the Bible and for us in general. For those of you celebrating Shabbat Shalom, have a great, great weekend. See you next week when we begin the next book, the last book of the 5 books of Moses. See you then.